In the last episode, we reviewed the major events of 1592. It's now 1593. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. The month of January was relatively uneventful. It was, however, the month when Ming soldiers would start to pour into Korea in significant numbers. On the 5th, Commander Wu Weizong would lead a vanguard force of around 5,000 men into northern Korea. He would soon be followed by Commander-in-Chief Li Rusong, who would bring around 35,000. He also had the Ming envoy Shen Weijing put under arrest, as he actually thought that the mildly friendly talks that he had had with Konishi Yukinaga was treasonous. And it should also be mentioned, though, that some of these men had already deserted. So we should conservatively put the number at just under 38,000, which is still honestly quite a lot. When Li Rusong marched south to Sunan, which was just 30 kilometers north of Pyongyang, he was joined by around 10,000 Korean soldiers under the command of Yi Il, the same commander that Konishi had beaten at the Battle of Sangju in June, and by regional commander Kim Ung-so. And at nearby Pohang Monastery, around 4,000 warrior monks, led by the well-respected monk Hyuzhong, were ready to join in the upcoming battle at a moment's notice. Now, if we combine the Ming Korean forces together, this would have been around 50,000 strong, give or take. Any Japanese carrying supplies on the road at this time were also in danger from Korean guerrilla attacks. And with the fields unattended in most places, the Japanese soldiers actually didn't have much to eat either. And who could forget that Yi Sun-sin had done an absolutely fantastic job at preventing most of the supplies that could be delivered by sea from arriving. In short, the Japanese weren't in a good spot at all. Now, during this time, Ukeda Hidei and the other commanders sent a letter to Kato Kiyomasa saying that his soldiers were actually badly needed to help protect the South. It would take some time, though, before he would receive this message. It should also come to no surprise that the Japanese had no idea that such a massive force was now headed their way at Pyongyang. See, Konishi still thought that the talks with Shen Weijing were still going on. Li Rusong had actually planned for this and sent word ahead of his armies that official Ming envoys would soon be there to continue with the peace negotiations. Konishi was so happy to hear this that he actually sent 20 men to escort the Ming envoys. Now, there's some conflicting sources about what happened next, but the one that I believe to be correct is that the Chinese actually had these men ambushed. Now, either way, only 3 of these men survived, and they raced back to Pyongyang. Konishi now knew that the peace talks were never real. On February 5th, 1593, the Ming and Choson Allied Army, a force of around 50,000 soldiers, arrived outside the walls of Pyongyang. Konishi's men, on the other hand, only numbered anywhere between 8,000 to 15,000, depending on what sources you look at. The men under Li Rusong were anxious to begin the fight and were shouting at the top of their lungs. Konishi's men, despite being severely outnumbered, also shouted, and they blew on horns and beat on drums to show that they weren't scared. Though it is really hard to imagine that they weren't. Konishi's plan was this. He would have around 2,000 men guard each of the 4 main gates into the city. Then, he and a select group of men would hold the center as a flexible reserve unit. I also want to throw out there that the Ayutthaya Kingdom of modern-day Thailand actually offered to send ships to attack the Japanese mainland. The Beijing court, though, politely declined due to distance, and honestly, the Ming just didn't think they would be much help. These political talks took place at the exact same time as the battle itself, though. The battle began on the 6th. Li Rusong decided to send Hu Zhang's warrior monks to attack Yongmyongsa. It was a high-walled temple complex on Morambyong Hill in the northern approach to the city of Pyongyang. It was occupied by Commander Matsura Shigenobu and just under 1,000 soldiers. You see, Li's fear was that if it wasn't occupied, it would open up his men to a counterattack from the rear if they approached the city. The fighting was still going on 2 days later, however, and despite getting help from Commander Wu Weicheng's men, Li Rusong was losing his patience and decided to hold a small ceremony early in the morning with burning incense to see if attacking would agree with the heavens. It would seem that he thought that the omens were in his favor, as he took his men south to attack Pyongyang. As they advanced towards the city, they could see that the Japanese soldiers were lined up on the wall, their banners flowing in the wind, and those that had swords drew them, and those that had spears held them high for the Ming and Koreans to see. The allied Chinese and Korean forces split up and encircled the city. The central Ming column under Yang Yuan and Zhang Shizhu would attack the north and south gates. The left column under Li Rubo, who is Li Rusong's younger brother, was to attack the southwest, and the Koreans under Yi Il and Kim Ung-so would attack the southwest. When all the commanders had their men in place, a cannon was fired to signal the assault. Chinese and Korean archers released volley after volley of fire arrows to set the buildings ablaze, while Chinese cannons were fired to destroy Pyongyang's gates. The foot soldiers, while this was happening, brought scaling ladders forward, and wave after wave of men attempted to climb the walls. The attackers were having a really hard time, though, as the concentrated matchlock fire of the Japanese and the stones that were being thrown over the walls at the attackers. And if the soldiers did actually manage to get over the walls, they were actually quickly cut down by Japanese swords and spears. Now, throughout the morning, the defenses were starting to look, well, like it was actually just too much for the Chinese and Korean soldiers. Commander-in-Chief Li Rusong saw that his men were starting to lose the will to fight. So he took his horse and rode up next to the wall, and then cut the head off of a man that was trying to desert the battle. He then carried the head around so that every unit could see it, and he then shouted and said, 300 yang of silver to the first man over the wall. Now, with the threat of execution and the promise of money, the men regained their fighting spirit and they renewed their assault. The Ming commander Wu Wuchang was now leading his men from the front, and then was actually wounded in the chest by a matchlock ball. Then his feet were actually crushed by a stone thrown over the wall. And even this did not stop the attacking forces. After a while, men started to find their way on the top of the wall, and after fierce fighting, enough space was created for more men to make it up the walls. Now, while this was happening, the Choson Gate in the north gave way from repeated cannon fire. The Japanese had actually been prepared for this though, and when it was clear that they could no longer hold the walls, they pulled back into their last line of defense. A fort made from logs, surrounded by earth mounds, had been made in the far corner in Pyongyang's triangular walls. With the battle seemingly won, the Korean and Chinese soldiers started to make their way into the city. But the battle was not over for Konishi and his men, and as the Allied attacking men formed up and made their way towards the fortification, Konishi's men leveled their matchlocks through the hundreds and hundreds of small openings in the barricades, and then sent hundreds of lead balls at the approaching men. It was an absolute slaughter. The Chinese and Koreans in their closely packed ranks were being torn through and through. Hundreds and hundreds of men started to drop instantly, and it was such a massive slaughter that the soldiers panicked and ran straight at Pyongyang. Li Rusong, hearing about this, sounded a gong letting his men know that it was time to withdraw entirely, and then returned with his men to their camp in the north of the city. He did, however, leave a guard of men to watch over Konishi and his men holed up in this small fort. They were actually mostly Korean. Li Rusong was now put in a very difficult position. In the narrow streets of Pyongyang, the Japanese matchlocks would absolutely tear through his men. I mean, could he even take the fort? Well, sure. But how many thousands of men was he willing to lose? And this is what he debated with himself all throughout the night. While Li Rusong debated this, Konishi Yukinaga and his men managed to slip out from Pyongyang undetected through the Taedong Gate, where they crossed the frozen river and headed south towards Seoul. Matsura Shigenobu was also able to escape from Yongmyong-sa with most of his men. Now, they actually arrived on February 17th. And this is where this episode will end. But before you go, we need to discuss something. And that something is inaccuracies. Now, if you look up this battle on Wikipedia, for example, the numbers just don't add up. I mean, it actually says that the Japanese had anywhere between 15,000 and 30,000 men. A number that doesn't make any sense, and I don't even know where it comes from. It also lists that the Japanese casualties were staggeringly higher than both the Korean and Ming, which also doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, when you think about how the battle actually played out, in fact, even the Ming had to send officials into Korea because the numbers reported didn't make any sense to them either. And there was also rumors that Korean civilians that had died were also being counted among the dead enemy. So I would like to caution anyone looking online for information on this war, as there's a lot of contradictory sources, and I would actually speculate that some of these are just made-up figures. Either way, the numbers are questionable at best, but this is indeed how the battle played out. And I'll leave that up for you to decide exactly what numbers you believe. And I would actually like to discuss that with you in the comment section down below. Either way, that's this episode. I'll see you next time.